Hi, this is Mike Spivey of the Spivey Consulting Group, and I wanted to speak today on the pandemic, the global outbreak of the coronavirus, technically known as COVID-19. We are not, as a firm, clearly, we have no expertise in infectious diseases. We have talked to multiple people in the medical community, but most of this podcast is going to be directed towards law schools and law school admissions, where we have over 180 years of expertise. Plus, we've talked to deans of admissions, deans of law schools, the CEO of a LSAT prep company, and we've reached out multiple times today to LSAC. So the questions that we've been posed online, we will address those based on not just our expertise, but that of others. I did want to briefly mention what we've learned from the medical community, which is incorporates a little bit of a video I shared online. The takeaway from the video is, if we worry some now, we're not going to have to be worrying more and a lot more later. So the response we've seen as far as canceling any sort of social gatherings in mass, any sort of large social gatherings, appears to be based on that medical advice. When schools are canceling classes, canceling admitted students programs, it would appear that they're taking the same advice that we've heard from medical experts, which is the more serious we take this now, the more it'll flatten the curve, lessen the exponentiality of the curve, so that hopefully none of us, you, us as a firm, law schools, LSAC, etc., will be dealing with this 6 months from now. But no one knows for certain. Let me now get on to the things we have a more clear picture of, although this is still uncharted territory, which is, how is this going to affect law schools? How is this going to affect law school admissions? And rather than just podcasting, I'm going to read the questions that have been posed to us as a firm and then take my best stab on each question. The first question is, infectious disease experts say that this won't be contained for another 6 months. Is there a chance that law schools go virtual for the entire 1L first semester? Are law schools preparing for this? So the answer is, I've heard mixed about how long this could last. And I think, again, it depends a little bit on how aggressively people socially isolate and aggressively cancel mass gatherings now. There's two ways to really address this. One is with testing and one is with social isolation. We're seeing now a dramatic increase in the social isolation. I saw a picture of an admissions colleague, former colleague, admissions dean of mine on a plane. He put it on his Facebook page. There was one person on the flight with him. So I would say 6 months sounds like maybe longer, and that projection is based on the current rate, which is going to slow down. But to the question at hand, are law schools preparing for this? For certain. The deans I've talked to are talking about all kinds. I mean, keep in mind, deans of law schools are lawyers. So they're talking about all kinds of worst case scenarios, which includes an entire first semester or even first year online. This will vary, and it will very much be dependent upon how quickly this current growth rate of the epidemic slows down. My best guess is that, and again, I'm just guessing, is that maybe international students will be taking online courses, but probably the growth rate will slow down enough over the summer so that classes will be back in session. There's also ABA considerations that a certain number of courses, only a certain number can be online. So, the ABA is going to have to remove that, which they will if the epidemic stays, at that high growth curve. Do we think the April LSAT will be canceled? Too early to say for sure. There's a number of LSAT questions. We've called LSAC a few times, and I've talked to the CEO of an LSAT prep company who suspects that they probably, if we had to guess, that March and April look like they're trending in that direction. But these are guesses. We do not know. So we're looking like maybe the best guess is March and April LSATs would be canceled. They might be canceled in certain locations, but that's a headache for LSAC. LSAC, incidentally, although most of their revenue now comes from tests and in CAS reports. So, they don't want to cancel, but they have tremendous financial reserves. And, just in theory, they could sit the year out and be fine with their financial reserves. ETS as well, even more so. We don't think any of this is going to happen, but I would say March and April test administrations in the United States are looking very precarious, and we're going to check out LSAC's website every day. And tests abroad have already been canceled. Do I expect the upcoming cycle will be a counter cycle? In other words, do you think submitting your application later in the cycle, November and afterwards, might help applicants? Just keep in mind that I am literally the person that came up with the word counter cycle a couple years ago. It's just because I was looking at data from a cycle a long time ago where it was pretty obvious that people who applied later did better. Counter cycles are exceptionally rare. We can only think of one in the last 20 years that we've looked at the data. But I talked to the dean of admissions of a top 10 law school a month ago. She had never heard the term counter cycle, which makes sense. She's not obsessive about Reddit, and I had made up the term a few years ago. But when I explained what it meant, she was like, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. People see a lot of early data that indicates a strong cycle from an admissions from a law school standpoint. But then there's a dramatic turn where things drop off so that they miscalculated based on early data, and then they have to overcorrect or recorrect at the end. The answer is yes, that could happen this cycle. It could happen that people who applied late and were put on hold are getting much closer looks, particularly if the March and April LSATs are canceled. But I should note that there is right now a surplus in LSAT scores 165 and above. So those schools are probably doing pretty well right now. We've looked at the data, and they probably have a surplus of admits so that their target medians are looking pretty strong. We don't see many scenarios where the schools in that range, the T30, the T40, are going to be changing much of their admissions procedures. They may be extending deadlines in some cases. I've heard mixed reviews. So I've seen a few schools change their deadlines. I have talked to a few schools, the deans of a few schools, where I have encouraged them to move back their deadlines because their admitted student programs are canceled. And then I have a consultant who's been in touch with a number of admission deans who say they don't plan on changing their deadlines. Again, this is another area where we're hearing mixed things on an hourly basis. I don't know the answer to the question, but I do know that if March and April LSAT tests are canceled here in the U.S. categorically, that schools below 165 median and particularly below 150 median are probably going to have to rely tremendously on their wait list, much more so than they were planning on. Uncertain on whether above 165, but it would be a lot less so. Is it a very bad idea to accept a May entry offer at this point? If we still want to attend the school, should we negotiate for a fall entry spot? A negotiation, it starts with an ask. And I think it's always, if you ask in a polite, civil manner for more money, for a fall admission instead of a May admission, the worst they can say is no. If you're pushy and you think that you're this, corporate CEO, hardball negotiator, and you ask in a uncivil manner with no leverage, then you're just going to aggravate the school, and you might get the worst possible outcome. So yeah, I think it's fine to ask. I suspect that the answer is still going to be the same, which is we want you as part of our May class, but I don't see any problem with asking the question. If March LSAT is canceled, what is the likelihood of more admissions off the wait list in the summer so the applicants can take the June LSAT? Again, we think that probably schools below 165 are going to be more apt to make later decisions, much more apt to use the June LSAT. I'm going to quote from a phone call of mine with a dean of admissions from a non T50 school. It's our job to fill a class, not to enforce arbitrary deadlines. So let me say that again, because this is a powerful message from a dean of admission. It is our job to fill a class, not to enforce arbitrary deadlines. And what that means for every law school, not that every law school necessarily agrees with this person, but I think most do, is that if they are facing atmospheric pressures where they're missing something, an LSAT median they were targeting, a GPA they were targeting, a gender balance they were targeting, a diversity mix they were targeting, spectacular applications they were hoping to be able to admit, they need to enroll a class. That is their job. Their boss, they don't want to march up to their boss's office, the dean of the law school, and say, you gave me a target class of 200 and I'm only bringing you 120 seat deposits because I arbitrarily said we won't look at applications past March 1. So most schools can tend to get very flexible if they're missing something. To quote Karen Buttenbaum, who's at my firm but used to be at Harvard, schools will always make room for a good applicant if they need them. So I think this is going to be particularly flexible when you look at schools that don't have a surplus. So schools outside the top 30, 40, below 165 LSAT, I think they are going to be particularly lenient with the arbitrary deadlines. Will international applicants from countries with high COVID-19 rates be somehow discriminated? Well, they're not going to be discriminated against in any kind of admissions file reading. So I know hundreds of admissions officers. I don't know a single one that would say this person is from a high COVID infectious rate country, so they're not a qualified law school student. They may be discriminated, and I'm using that term now loosely, they may have more problems getting into the country. So Peter Kramer at my firm, who's an American citizen, but he spent much of his early life, he's from Germany, he was in charge of a LLM program. He sees this scenario, the worst case scenario where people are going to need a valid I-20 to get an interview at a U.S. embassy abroad or at a consulate, in that this might not be, many of these interviews are suspended. So what we think would happen in that case is international applicants are still going to be admitted, but they are more likely to be taking first semester courses online. So the ABA is more likely to waive, I would say highly likely to waive stipulations about online courses, and that we can't predict what the government's going to do, but if you're in a country where the government has banned travel, that ban may stay in effect depending on how long this pandemic lasts. And it's more likely that international students, particularly from countries where the infection is still high, they'll be taking classes online. But let me repeat, your file is going to be read based on the strength of your application, not based on the infectious disease rate of the country you're from. I cannot state that highly enough. Okay, so now about next cycle. This is an interesting question. Do we anticipate this impacting the next cycle? I do. I think that we're going to have a very large June test, and I think that yield rates might be a little bit higher this year because I think that it seems like we're heading towards a short-term recession. During recessions, historically, there is an early increase in applications to law schools. It makes sense because it's harder to get a job out of college. And if I had to guess, and I'm guessing, but I think next cycle you're going to see an increase in applications. And I think it's going to look dramatic early on. So this cycle has been a slow cycle and a hard cycle, and I would guess that next cycle we're going to see. And plus there's an election coming up, which tends to create increases in applications too. People are more civic minded. Let me give a little bit of admissions advice. I can't tell you how many deans of admissions were so sick about reading about the election and personal statements 4 years ago. When you're in admissions, you've heard me talk about this before, positive differentiation matters. So if 9 out of every 15 personal statements are about how someone was inspired by the 2020 election, and that's why they're applying to law school, that's not going to be a personal statement that positively stands out. Will there be a pause on decisions? No, admissions officers can easily do work remotely. They've been doing work remotely from years. They've been reading applications from planes, reading applications from home. I think what the pause is going to be on is the ability to maybe get in touch with admissions officers, particularly with in-person visits. Possibly even a pause on the phone if people are working from home. But the application file reading pace is going to be the same. Now, the pace might be slow because this is a slow cycle. And the data that admissions offices are getting is not comparable to any other cycle before. So the pace might be slow, but the ability for admissions officers to read applications, no slower. It's all electronic now. Will this change the emphasis by schools on the type of candidates they're looking for? Yeah, maybe, because again, they might not be getting, most schools will take a March or April or even June applicant if those applicants come in with something that the school needs. So I've already talked a little bit about that. I don't think that the threat of a recession is going to factor too much into the type of applicant this cycle that a school would look at. If we had a longer term recession, because I was the Dean of Career Services, I also wore that hat during the Great Recession, we were more and more in touch with the admissions office about getting, as the Great Recession lasted year after year. That was just a really, really tough time to get a job. And I remember working, 7 days a week, 12, 15-hour days. So we were, there were some students we just knew we couldn't place, and we were in touch more and more with admissions about, maybe trying to flag people without work experience or who had CNF or other red flags in their application. To answer the question, do I think that'll happen this cycle? No. Do I think if there is a recession and it lasts for more than a year, I think that it'll start impacting how files are read next cycle. If deposit deadlines are extended, and then the person who asked this question says, which seems almost certain at this point, how far out do you think they will be extended? Well, to begin with, I very much hesitate to use words like which seems almost certain, because I'm hearing mixed things from law schools. Some law schools are saying categorically no. Other law schools are already doing it. And some of deposit deadlines depend on when someone was admitted. If you were admitted in September, maybe they're going to give you another month if you couldn't attend an admitted student's day, but very possibly no. If you're admitted a month from now, every year at schools, people are admitted off the wait list, April, May, June, July. Well, if you're going to admit someone in July, you're going to give them a seat deposit deadline in late July. So if LSATs are canceled and more people are admitted later in the year, there will be much more extended seat deposit deadlines all the way through June and July. Again, we don't think this is going to impact the top end schools as much because they were over surplused in high scores. It could if some of the people with the high scores decide not to go to law school. But even that is looking less likely because it looks like we might be in for a short-term recession. Will this impact when decisions are sent out? We've kind of talked about this. It's just going to be a slow cycle. And I think that for schools, again, under 165, if March and April are canceled, actually a lot of waitlisted people are going to be getting phone calls a lot quicker. So even though it's going to be a slow summer, LSAT cancellations will trigger a number of schools to actually start making waitlist phone calls very soon, I would suspect. This person says they're not me, but they expect the economy to be back up and running in 3 years' time. I would agree with that. So maybe this person was me with a fake name named Female President of USA. We've addressed most of the other questions. There was a question, this is a little outside your wheelhouse, but do you think my summer associate program will be canceled? I was a former dean of career services as well. I think that law schools are probably going to be risk averse too. So I could see them canceling programs but giving stipends. I could see them trying to come up with creative ways to work remotely. I do think probably some summer associate programs will be canceled, particularly if it looks like we're going to head towards a long-term recession. So we've answered all the questions. So let me give you a parting takeaway. I was an admissions officer during 9/11. In fact, I was supposed to be on a flight, an American Airlines flight from Nashville, Tennessee to New York City, and then checking into the New York City World Trade Center Marriott on September 11th. Not just me, but some of my very close friends, some of my colleagues at Spivey Consulting as well. On September 12th, there was supposed to be the New York City Law School admissions forum. And all the flights got canceled for over a week. Obviously, the forum got canceled. And things changed. And I would say this, I mean, it was a very stressful time to be in admissions. I remember the following week being on a flight, and there was only like one other or two other people on the flight. People at the airport were crying, and the hotel was empty. So that was stressful for us, but it also, when people are stressed, I think they gain empathy. And we were very flexible with applicants who were going through traumatic times. We understood that they were anxious, and we were flexible with people who were expressing themselves to us. So I guess what I would say is this: do not hesitate to call a law school. Do not hesitate to check in with LSAC. Absolutely, if you're not feeling well, do not hesitate to check in with your doctor. I think you're going to see, which is what we saw after 9/11, which is the only thing I can come close to seeing any parallel to, is you're going to see a lot more empathy from professionals on this side about anxiety that the coronavirus is causing. At the end of the day, we don't know how long this is going to last. It sounds like the experts are saying that if we worry some now, we're going to have to worry less later. So I do think these cancellations are probably in everyone's favor right now. And as a firm, my commitment to you all is we're going to keep you updated. I'm going to continue to talk to deans of law schools, continue to talk to deans of admission, and continue to monitor both the market and the health experts. And, we'll see how long this lasts, but we'll be in touch. I appreciate all the questions, and I appreciate everyone tuning in. Thanks. This was Mike Spivey.